The envelope felt impossibly heavy in my hands as I sat in my rental car across the street from our vacation home. The quaint beachfront cottage with its weathered blue shutters and wraparound deck had been our sanctuary for 8 years. The place where James and I had spent every summer creating memories I thought would last a lifetime. Now I stared at it through the windshield as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine white sand, feeling like a stranger trespassing on someone else's dream. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A bright yellow sports car I'd never seen before was parked in the driveway, top down despite the autumn chill. And through the large bay windows I could see movement, a flash of red hair that definitely didn't belong to anyone in my family. The sound of laughter drifted across the lawn, carried on the salt-tinged breeze. His laughter intertwined with hers. A sound I hadn't heard in months, at least not directed at anything I'd said or done. I opened the envelope one more time, though I'd already memorized every word of the document inside. The deed transfer, finalized just hours ago, with the new owner's name printed in bold black letters. Not James Sullivan, not even Rebecca Sullivan. Someone who would now call this place their own, while James and his red-headed companion remained, blissfully unaware their beach idyll was about to come to an abrupt end. My phone buzzed with a text from my real estate agent. All set. New owners will arrive tomorrow at 10 a.m. for walkthrough. Keys with lockbox code at office. Congratulations on the quick sale. I should have felt triumphant. The property had sold for well above market value. A small bidding war had erupted when word got out that the charming cottage overlooking Silver Bay was suddenly available. The funds were already in my account, a cushion of security I hadn't expected when my world imploded 6 weeks ago. But triumph wasn't what filled my chest as I watched James stride onto the deck, beer in hand, sunglasses pushed up on his head in that careless way that had once made my heart skip. It was something quieter, yet more potent, a sense of reclaiming control, of refusing to be a footnote in the story of my own life. 6 weeks earlier, I had been a different person. Rebecca Sullivan, devoted wife of 17 years, middle, school art teacher, and perpetual peacekeeper. The woman who smoothed rough edges, who made everything work so seamlessly that her own efforts became invisible. I was the woman who believed that love meant always putting someone else's needs first, even when they had long stopped doing the same for you. The first sign something was wrong should have been when James suggested I visit my sister Charlotte alone for her surgery recovery. "You haven't seen her in ages, Becca," he'd said, eyes fixed on his laptop screen rather than my face. "And I've got that software launch coming up. I'll be working 80-hour weeks anyway." Charlotte lived in Arizona, a 4-hour flight from our home in Massachusetts. Her mastectomy was scheduled during peak season at the beach house, a time when we typically spent weekends there together. But his arguments made sense. They always did. James had a gift for making his preferences sound like practical solutions. That benefited everyone. Besides, he'd added, finally looking up with that smile that still made my stomach flutter after all these years, "You deserve some sister time. You're always taking care of everyone else." So I'd gone, spending 3 weeks helping Charlotte through her initial recovery, calling James every evening with updates. His responses grew increasingly brief, his excuses for not calling more frequent. Late meetings, client dinners, work emergencies. I told myself this was normal, that his career in technology consulting had always been demanding. I ignored the subtle shift in his voice, the way our conversations felt like obligations rather than connections. It was Charlotte, doped up on pain medication, but somehow seeing more clearly than I could, who finally said the words I'd been avoiding. "Something's wrong, Becca," she'd murmured, watching me check my phone for the third time in an hour. "And I think you know it." I'd defended him immediately, listing his work pressures, the major client he was trying to land, the promotion he'd been chasing for years. Charlotte had simply reached for my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone still recovering from major surgery. "When was the last time you checked the beach house security app?" The question caught me off guard. We'd installed cameras last year after a minor break-in. Nothing stolen, but James had insisted on a comprehensive system that we could monitor remotely. I rarely checked it, trusting that the automated alerts would notify us of any unusual activity. "I don't know," I admitted. "A few weeks, maybe?" "Check it now," Charlotte said, her voice gentle but firm. Something in her tone made my hand tremble as I opened the app. The system immediately connected, showing me the front porch view of our beach house. Nothing seemed amiss. The property looked peaceful, exactly as we'd left it. "I don't see anything wrong," I said, relief washing over me. Charlotte took the phone from my hand and navigated to the recorded footage section, scrolling back to weekends. "James said he was at a conference in Chicago, right?" My stomach tightened. "Yes, from Friday to Sunday." She pressed play on a clip from Saturday evening. The timestamp read 7:43 p.m. The front door opened, and there was James, carrying grocery bags, laughing over his shoulder at someone still out of frame. A moment later, she appeared, tall and slender, with vibrant red hair cascading down her back. She carried a weekend bag and a bottle of wine, and the easy familiarity with which she entered our vacation home made it immediately clear this wasn't their first visit. I watched in stunned silence as James set down the groceries to pull her into his arms, kissing her in the doorway of the home we had lovingly furnished together, the painting I'd done of the bay at sunset visible on the wall behind them. "I'm so sorry," Charlotte whispered, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. "I noticed it when I was browsing through to see the new deck furniture you mentioned. I thought you knew." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But I hadn't known, or perhaps more accurately, I hadn't wanted to know. How many weekends had he spent with her while I thought he was working? How many business trips had actually been romantic getaways in our personal sanctuary? My mind raced backward, cataloging inconsistencies, excuses, late nights, and changed. Plans that had accumulated so gradually I'd stopped questioning them. The distance that had grown between us hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow drift, like a boat untethered, moving inch by inch from shore until suddenly you look up and can barely see the land. That night, after Charlotte had fallen, asleep, I went through months of security footage. The evidence was devastating in its thoroughness. James and the redhead, whose name I would later learn was Elise, had been using our beach house regularly for at least 7 months. Sometimes for weekends, occasionally for full weeks when he'd told me he was traveling for work. More painful than the betrayal itself was realizing how perfectly I'd been set up to facilitate it. My teaching schedule, my predictable routines, my trust and my reluctance to bother him when he was working, all of it had created the ideal circumstances for deception. I had made it easy for him to live a double life, and he had taken full advantage. In the quiet of Charlotte's guest room, staring at the ceiling as dawn broke, I made my first decision. I would not confront him immediately. Anger demanded immediate, Action, but something deeper. A sense of self-preservation I didn't know I possessed. Urged caution. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was facing before I showed my hand. The next morning, I called my friend Diane, an attorney, who specialized in family law. I'd attended her divorce 5 years earlier, a surprisingly amicable affair that had left her financially secure and co-parenting effectively with her ex-husband. At the time, I'd admired her composure while secretly feeling superior that my marriage would never face such challenges. "I need your advice," I said when she answered, my voice steadier than I expected. "Professionally." Diane didn't ask questions when I explained I needed guidance without formal representation yet. Instead, she outlined clear steps. Document everything. Understand our financial situation completely, and consider my desired outcomes before making any moves. "The biggest mistake people make," she said, "is acting from hurt before they understand their options. Knowledge is leverage, Rebecca. Gather it methodically." For the next week, while still at Charlotte's, I became a detective in my own life. I accessed our joint accounts, documented our assets, and reviewed property records. What I found was both reassuring and disturbing. Our finances were largely as I understood them to be. James had always included me in major decisions, and we lived comfortably on our combined incomes. But there were irregularities. A credit card I didn't recognize with significant charges for restaurants and hotels, far from any of his supposed business locations. Transfers to a separate account he'd opened last year. A pattern of cash withdrawals that had accelerated in recent months. Most significantly, I discovered something about our beach house that I had either forgotten or never fully registered. It was solely in my name. The property had been a partial inheritance from my grandparents, who had owned land along Silver Bay for generations. When we decided to build there 10 years ago, my inheritance covered the land value, while our joint savings built the house. For tax purposes, the deed remained in my name alone. My grandmother had insisted on this arrangement, in fact. "Property is a woman's best insurance policy," she'd said, patting my hand when we discussed the deed. I'd laughed it off then, assuring her that such precautions weren't necessary in a marriage like ours. Now her foresight seemed almost prophetic. Armed with this knowledge, I completed my time at Charlotte's, helping her through her final checkups while quietly laying groundwork for what would come next. I contacted real estate agents in Silver Bay, describing a hypothetical situation where I might need to sell quickly. I spoke with our family financial advisor under the guise of planning a surprise investment for our upcoming anniversary, gathering information about how our assets could be divided. James continued his pattern, checking in sporadically with distracted affection. I matched his tone precisely, sharing mundane details about Charlotte's recovery, never hinting at my discoveries. When he mentioned he'd be taking a working retreat at the beach house the following week to finalize the presentation for the Meridian account, I expressed appropriate disappointment that I wouldn't be joining him. "Maybe it's better this way," he said, his voice brightening with what I now recognized as poorly disguised relief. "You focus on Charlotte, and I'll have everything ready for us to celebrate when you're back. We'll do a long weekend at the beach house. Just the two of us. Just the two of us." The phrase that had once signaled romance now revealed the extent of his compartmentalization. His life with me, his life with her, never acknowledging how the boundaries between them had dissolved. 2 days before I was scheduled to return home, I made my final preparations. I met with the most promising real estate agent in Silver Bay, a sharp-eyed woman named Meredith who had specialized in luxury beachfront properties for 20 years. "The market's hot right now," she said as we walked through the cottage while James was at his actual office in Boston. "Limited inventory, lots of cash buyers looking for exactly this kind of property. If you're serious about selling quickly, we could list today and have offers by the weekend." I signed the listing agreement on the spot, with one condition: no signs on the property, no lockbox yet, no advance notice to anyone until I gave the final approval. Meredith raised an eyebrow, but didn't question my requirements. "We'll do a whisper listing," she said. "I have 4 clients who've been waiting for something like this to become available. They can view it tomorrow while you're here, and we'll handle everything else electronically." True to her word, by the time I left Silver Bay the next day, we had 3 offers, all above asking price. I accepted the highest, a tech executive from New York with a young family, looking for a summer retreat and willing to close in 10 days with cash. No contingencies, no inspections, no delay. When I finally returned home to Boston, I greeted James with a convincing display of the same affection I'd always shown. We fell into our familiar rhythms, me teaching art classes, him working late, both of us navigating around the growing void in our marriage with well-practiced ease. I waited until he mentioned his upcoming work retreat before making my move. "The beach house looks gorgeous this time of year," I said casually over dinner, 4 days before his planned trip. "The hydrangeas must be in full bloom." "You should come down after the weekend," he suggested, his tone careful. "Once I've wrapped up the presentation, we could spend a few days there together before fall semester gets busy for you." I smiled, meeting his eyes across the table. "That sounds perfect." The next morning, I signed the final paperwork for the sale of our beach house. The funds would transfer immediately upon recording the deed, which would happen the day before. James and Elise were set to arrive. The new owners were scheduled to take possession the following afternoon. I arranged for document delivery to our Boston home rather than electronically, ensuring I'd be the one to receive the confirmation packet. When it arrived 3 days later in its unassuming manila envelope, I felt a strange sense of calm descend. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my agency in a situation where I'd been rendered a supporting character in my own life. Which brings me back to that rental car across from the beach house, watching James and Elise enjoy what they didn't realize was their final evening in a property that no longer belonged to either of us. I didn't approach them then. Instead, I drove to the small inn at the edge of town and checked in for the night. I ordered room service, opened a bottle of wine, and drafted 2 letters. The first was to James, explaining exactly what I knew, what I had done, and what would happen next. The second was to myself, a promise about the woman I intended to become now that the foundations I'd built my life upon had crumbled. Morning broke with perfect clarity, sunshine streaming through the inn's gauzy curtains as I prepared to face what would likely be the most confrontational day of my otherwise conflict-avoidant life. I'd chosen my outfit carefully. A blue linen dress James had never seen before, purchased during my stay at Charlotte's. Not my usual style of muted colors and comfortable practicality, but something with clean lines and quiet confidence. War. Paint of a different sort. The beach house looked almost ethereal in the morning light, its weathered shingles glowing golden as the sun climbed higher. I parked my rental car directly behind the yellow sports car this time, hemming it in against the hedge of hydrangeas we'd planted 5 summers ago. Briefly, I wondered if the new owners would maintain them or tear them out for something more fashionable. Odd how the mind fixates on small details when larger emotions threaten to overwhelm. As I approached the front door, key still on my chain, Though I no longer had legal right to use it, I heard music playing inside. The jazz station James always insisted created the perfect weekend ambiance. My hand hovered over the doorknob, doubt suddenly clouding my resolve. Was I really prepared for what waited on the other side? To see my husband in our shared space with another woman, to witness the casual intimacy they'd established in my absence? But then I remembered the security footage, the easy familiarity with which they'd moved through rooms I had decorated, the painting above the mantel that had taken me 3 months to complete, the one James had barely acknowledged. When I first hung it, now serving as backdrop to their stolen weekends, the doubt evaporated, replaced by a steel-spined certainty. I didn't knock. This had been my home too, after all. I simply inserted my key and opened the door. The scene in the kitchen was painfully domestic. James stood at the stove in his faded Harvard t-shirt and pajama bottoms, spatula in hand, while the red-haired woman, even prettier up close, I noted with an odd detachment, sat at the counter island drinking coffee from the handmade pottery mug I'd bought from a local artist. Last summer, they both froze when I entered, the tableau of contented coupledom shattering into jagged fragments of awkward reality. James recovered first, his expression cycling rapidly from shock to guilt to a strange, defensive anger. "Rebecca," he said, my name sounding foreign on his lips. "What are you doing here?" The absurdity of the question nearly made me laugh. What was I doing in the beach house I owned that I had helped design and decorate? What was I doing interrupting his carefully orchestrated deception? "I thought I'd surprise you," I replied, my voice steadier than I could have hoped. Seems I'm the one who got surprised instead. The redhead, Elise, had gone very still, her knuckles white around the coffee mug. She was younger than me, though not dramatically so. Early 30s perhaps to my 42. Her eyes darted between James and me, clearly calculating her next move in a situation that had veered wildly off script. "This isn't," James began, then stopped himself, apparently realizing how ridiculous the standard denial would sound given the circumstances. He set the spatula down carefully, as though the proper placement of kitchen utensils mattered in this moment of marital implosion. "You should have called first." "Yes, that would have been the considerate thing to do," I agreed, allowing the irony to flavor my words. Inconsiderate surprises are terrible, aren't they? Like discovering your husband has been bringing another woman to your vacation home for 7 months. Elise stood abruptly, nearly knocking over the bar stool. "I should go." "Actually," I said, turning to face her directly for the first time, "I'd prefer if you stayed. This concerns you too." Something in my tone must have conveyed the futility of escape, because she sank back onto the stool, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. I noticed she wore one of James's button-down shirts over her shorts, the casual appropriation of his clothing a remarkably intimate gesture that somehow hurt more than the security footage had. "How long have you known?" James asked, his hand braced against the countertop as though he might need physical support. "Long enough," I replied. I reached into my bag and withdrew the manila envelope, placing it on the granite island between us. "But that's not really why I'm here." James stared at the envelope but made no move to open it. "Is that divorce papers? Because we should talk privately before—" "It's not divorce papers," I interrupted. "Not yet, anyway. It's the deed transfer for this house. I sold it, closing was yesterday." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sizzle of forgotten eggs burning on the stove. James's face drained of color so completely I momentarily worried he might faint. "You what?" he finally managed. "I sold the beach house?" I repeated, each word distinct and clear. "The new owners will be here at 10 for the walkthrough. You have about 40 minutes to pack your things and leave." James turned off the stove with a jerky movement, his shock giving way to anger. "You can't do that. This is our house, our vacation property. You had no right—" "Actually, I had every legal right," I cut in. "The property is solely in my name. Has been since we built it. Your name isn't on the deed, and Massachusetts doesn't automatically consider vacation properties as shared marital assets unless both spouses are on the title. You can confirm that with a lawyer if you'd like, but it won't change the fact that this house no longer belongs to either of us." Elise made a small, distressed sound. "James, you said this was your house. You told me you owned it." The look he shot her contained a warning that told me volumes about their relationship dynamic. "This isn't the time, Elise." I felt a surprising flicker of sympathy for her. Had she known about me? The wedding ring James still wore suggested she must have, but what story had he spun to justify their relationship? What promises had he made about their future? "James," I said, redirecting his attention, "I've booked a room for you at the Harbor Inn for tonight. I assumed you'd need time to make arrangements." I placed a room key card on the counter next to the deed transfer. "The reservation is under your name. After that, you'll need to figure out your own accommodations." His face had taken on the rigid quality I recognized from our infrequent but significant arguments. The expression that preceded his most cutting remarks, carefully calibrated to exploit my insecurities. I braced myself. "This is vindictive." "And childish," he snapped. "Selling our beach house without discussion because your feelings are hurt?" This is exactly the kind of emotional overreaction that's been suffocating our marriage for years. The words were designed to wound, to shift blame, to position my response to his betrayal as the real problem. 6 weeks ago, they would have landed precisely as intended, sending me into a spiral of self-doubt and apology. But something had fundamentally shifted during my time at Charlotte's, a recalibration of my internal compass that pointed toward a different true north. "No, James," I said quietly. "What's suffocating is discovering that the person who vowed to honor and cherish you has been systematically lying to your face while creating a parallel life with someone else. What's suffocating is realizing how completely I've compromised myself to maintain a marriage that exists only in my imagination." I turned to Elise, who had been watching our exchange with wide eyes. "I don't know what he's told you about me or our marriage. I don't know if you're the first or one of many. But I do know that a man who will lie to his wife of 17 years will have no qualms about lying to you, too." She flinched as though I'd slapped her, but I saw recognition in her eyes. Whatever fairy tale James had spun for her, some part of her had questioned its veracity. James stepped between us, physically blocking my view of Elise. "That's enough. You've made your point with this real estate stunt. Now let's discuss this like adults. There's no need to involve Elise in our issues." "Elise became involved in our issues the moment you brought her into our home," I countered. "And this isn't a stunt. It's a consequence, one of many that will follow." I glanced at my watch. 9:35. The new owners would arrive soon, excited to begin making this space their own. You need to pack now. Whatever you leave behind becomes property of the new owners. James's face hardened with the realization that I wasn't bluffing. "This isn't over, Rebecca." "No," I agreed, meeting his gaze steadily. "It's just beginning. But the beach house part is definitely over." I watched as they moved through the cottage, hastily gathering belongings, the romantic getaway transformed into a frantic evacuation. Elise disappeared into the bathroom with a small overnight bag while James pulled clothes from the dresser drawers, his movements increasingly agitated as the reality of the situation sank in. "Where am I supposed to put everything?" he demanded, gesturing to the artwork, books, and accumulated treasures of a decade. "My great-grandfather's fishing rods are in the shed. My mother's china is in the cabinet. You can't expect me to just abandon family heirlooms." "I've arranged for anything clearly belonging to your family to be packed and delivered to the Boston house," I said. The distinction felt important. "The movers will arrive this afternoon after the walkthrough. They have a detailed inventory." His expression registered surprise at my thoroughness. "You've been planning this for weeks." 6 weeks, I confirmed. "Since I saw the security footage of you and Elise while I was at Charlotte's." This revelation clearly knocked him off balance. "You've known since then? You've been pretending everything was normal for 6 weeks?" "Yes," I said simply. "I learned from the best." The sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of Meredith, my real estate agent, 15 minutes early. Through the front windows, I saw her emerge from her sleek black SUV, clipboard in hand, adjusting her blazer before approaching the house. "Time's up," I told James, moving toward the door to greet her. "Rebecca," he called after me. His voice shifted to the persuasive tone he used in business negotiations. "We can talk about this. We can work through it. Selling the house was extreme, but I understand you're hurt. Let's not make any more permanent decisions until we've had time to process." I paused, hand on the doorknob, and looked back at the man I had loved for nearly half my life. In that moment, I saw him clearly. Not the heroic figure I'd constructed in my mind, nor the villain of recent discoveries, but simply a flawed human being who had made selfish choices without considering their impact on others. "You know what? I've realized, James, we've been working through things our entire marriage. I've been processing your needs, your ambitions, your desires ahead of my own for so long that I almost forgot I had them. Not anymore." Meredith's crisp knock prevented further conversation. When I opened the door, her professional smile faltered, slightly as she registered the tension radiating from within. "Good morning, Rebecca," she said cautiously. "I hope I'm not too early." The Brannings were so excited they asked if we could possibly move up the walkthrough. "You're right on time," I assured her. "My husband and his friend were just leaving." James appeared behind me, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, Elise trailing awkwardly in his wake with her overnight bag. "Mr. Sullivan," Meredith acknowledged with the neutral politeness of someone determined not to involve herself in personal drama. "Lovely day for a drive back to the city." His jaw tightened at her pointed suggestion. With one last burning look at me, equal parts anger, confusion, and something that might have been respect, he brushed past us onto the porch. "I'll see you in Boston," he said, the words somewhere between a statement and a question. "Yes," I confirmed. "We have much to discuss." As they loaded their hastily packed bags into Elise's yellow sports car, I felt a curious lightness spread through my chest. Not happiness, exactly. The situation was far too complex and painful for such a simple emotion. But something adjacent to relief. The first step in a journey toward reclaiming my life had been taken, and while the path ahead remained uncertain, I had proven to myself that I possessed the strength to walk it. The Brannings arrived precisely at 10, a cheerful couple in their 40s with twin 10-year-old daughters who immediately raced toward the beach access path, their excitement palpable. David Branning, a software entrepreneur with kind eyes and an easy laugh, shook my hand warmly. "We can't thank you enough for choosing our offer," he said as we began the walkthrough. "Our family has been dreaming of a place on Silver Bay for years." His wife, Lisa, an elementary school principal with a practical air that reminded me of Charlotte, nodded agreement. "The girls are already planning which bedroom they'll share. We're hoping to create the kind of summer memories they'll treasure forever." As we moved through the cottage, I found myself sharing little details about the property, the best spot to watch sunsets, how the upstairs windows caught perfect cross breezes on summer nights, the temperamental quirks of the vintage stove. With each revealed secret, each transferred piece of knowledge, I felt myself releasing my attachment to the physical space while preserving the meaningful experiences it had contained. "The previous owners clearly loved this place deeply," Lisa commented as she admired the built-in bookshelves James and I had designed together. "It shows in every detail." "Yes," I said softly. "They did." After the Brannings left, promising to send photos of their first family summer, I stood alone in the empty living room. The cottage felt different already, as though it was preparing itself for its new custodians. I walked through each room one final time, not to mourn what was lost, but to honor what had been before releasing it completely. In the master bedroom, I remembered lazy Sunday mornings reading beside James, the companionable silence we'd once shared as precious as any conversation. In the kitchen, I recalled holiday meals with friends, laughter echoing off the open beams as wine flowed and stories unfolded. On the deck, I honored countless sunsets witnessed, dreams shared, futures planned with hopeful hearts. These memories belonged to me regardless of what happened next. They weren't invalidated by James's betrayal or my response to it. They simply existed as part of my life's tapestry, threads among many that created the woman I was becoming. I left my key on the counter with a brief note for the movers who would arrive later. Then I walked down to the shoreline one last time, removing my shoes to feel the sand between my toes. The tide was coming in, waves erasing footprints as quickly as they were made, a fitting metaphor for this moment of transition. Standing at the water's edge, I unfurled the second letter I'd written the night before, the promises to myself about the woman I intended to become. I read each commitment aloud, letting the ocean breeze carry my words outward. I promised to value my own dreams as highly as I valued others. I promised to recognize red flags rather than color them with optimism. I promised to build a life so full that no single person's presence or absence can define it. I promised to treat myself with the compassion I've always offered so freely to everyone else. I promised to remember that starting over isn't failure, it's courage. As I drove away from Silver Bay that afternoon, I felt the weight of the manila envelope in a new way. What had begun as an instrument of consequence had transformed into something else entirely. Proof that I was capable of decisive action, that I could protect myself when necessary, that my future remained unwritten despite the painful ending of the story I'd thought would last forever. In the rearview mirror, the cottage grew smaller until it disappeared behind the coastal bend. Ahead stretched an open road leading back to Boston, where the next chapter awaited. James would be there, likely already constructing narratives that cast him as victim rather than architect of our marriage's collapse. Hard conversations and legal complexities loomed. The dissolution of 17 years together would not be simple or painless. But for this moment, driving along the coastal highway with windows down and possibilities unfurling before me, I allowed myself to feel the first tentative unfurling of hope. Not hope that James would change or that our marriage could be salvaged. Those illusions had been permanently shattered. This was something more fundamental. Hope that I was strong enough to face whatever came next, that pain could be survived, and that an unexpected ending might lead to a beginning I couldn't yet imagine. The sun glinted off the water to my right, constant and reassuring. Like the tide that had washed away my footprints, time would gradually smooth the jagged edges of betrayal, not erasing what had happened, but integrating it into a larger landscape, where it became just one feature among many, significant but no longer all-consuming. I turned up the radio, letting music fill the car as I pressed gently on the accelerator. Whatever waited in Boston, I was driving toward it on my own terms, finally the protagonist in my own story rather than a supporting character in someone else's. The road ahead might be uncertain, but for the first time in years it felt like my road to travel. Boston greeted me with a summer downpour, sheets of rain turning the familiar streets into reflective surfaces that doubled the city lights. The 3-hour drive from Silver Bay had given me time to prepare for the confrontation that surely awaited at our townhouse. But as I navigated the rain-slicked streets of Beacon Hill, I found myself hoping for a temporary reprieve. Just one night to sleep in my own bed before the storm that would follow. That hope evaporated when I turned onto our street and spotted James's BMW parked directly in front of our home, defying the resident-only parking restrictions he usually observed meticulously. Not a good sign. James breaking small rules typically presaged larger boundary violations. I parked 2 blocks away and sat for a moment, gathering my strength as rain drummed against the roof of my rental car. The manila envelope lay on the passenger seat where I'd placed it after leaving Silver Bay. I slipped it into my bag, a tangible reminder of my resolve as I prepared to enter what no longer felt like a sanctuary. The front lights were on, spreading a deceptively warm glow across our small front garden. I'd planted lavender and rosemary along the brick pathway last spring, their scent releasing as raindrops struck their leaves. The familiar fragrance steadied me as I approached our red front door, key in hand. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, except for the sound of ice clinking in a glass from the direction of our study. I set my bag down, removed my rain-damp jacket, and followed the sound. James sat in his leather armchair by the window, tumbler of whiskey balanced on the arm, staring into the middle distance with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. He looked up when I entered, his eyes reflecting a complex mixture of emotions. Anger, predominant among them, but also confusion and something that might have been genuine grief. "You're back," he said, the words flat and unnecessary. "It's still my home," I replied, remaining in the doorway rather than taking my usual seat across from him. The subtle shift in positioning felt important. I was no longer automatically assuming my place in the choreography of our marriage. "Is it?" he asked, taking a deliberate sip of his drink. "Or are you planning to sell this house too without telling me?" The accusation might have landed more effectively if it hadn't been so clearly designed to put me on the defensive. "The beach house was in my name," I reminded him. "This house is jointly owned. Different situation entirely." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, ice cubes clinking softly. "Legally different, perhaps, Morally, it's the same impulsive, vindictive behavior. Impulsive? I couldn't help the short laugh that escaped me. James, I spent 6 weeks planning that sale. I researched property laws, consulted professionals, and timed everything precisely. There was nothing impulsive about it. He frowned, clearly unsettled by this insight into my methodical approach. The James I'd married had always prided himself on being the strategic thinker in our relationship, the one who planned while I supposedly acted on emotion. And it wasn't about vindictiveness, I continued, moving into the room to stand by the bookshelf rather than taking a seat. It was about consequences. Consequences, he repeated, setting his glass down with deliberate care. You make it sound like you're disciplining a child, not addressing a situation between adults. Adults communicate honestly, I countered. Adults don't create elaborate deceptions spanning months. Adults don't bring their affair partners to shared property and expect no repercussions. He flinched slightly at the word affair, as though naming it explicitly crossed some line. What happened with Elise is complicated. No, quantum physics is complicated. What you did was straightforward. You lied, repeatedly and extensively, to maintain a double life that satisfied your desires without regard for anyone else involved. James stood suddenly, moving toward the bar cart to pour another drink. The controlled precision of his movements told me he was angrier than he wanted to appear. You want to talk about honesty? He asked, back still turned to me. Let's talk about how you've been performing the role of devoted wife for years while growing increasingly distant. Let's talk about how your career always took precedence when opportunities for mine arose. Let's talk about the unspoken resentment that's been simmering between us since you decided not to have children. The accusation struck like a physical blow, so unexpected and fundamentally untrue that for a moment I couldn't respond. We had jointly decided against children after 3 years of trying and 2 miscarriages that had left me emotionally shattered. James had been the one to suggest we stop fertility treatments, citing the toll they were taking on both of us. That's a convenient rewriting of history, I finally managed, working to keep my voice steady. But we both know it isn't true. He turned back to face me, drink in hand. Isn't it? We've been living parallel lives for years, Rebecca. Elise just happened to be the first person who made me feel truly seen in a very long time. If you felt unseen, you could have said something, I pointed out. You could have suggested counseling, expressed dissatisfaction, even asked for separation. Instead, you created an elaborate deception while maintaining the benefits of our marriage. James took a long swallow of his drink. I tried talking to you. You didn't hear me. When? I challenged. When did you ever say, Rebecca, I'm unhappy in our marriage? His expression shifted to one I recognized all too well. The look that preceded a strategic retreat when facts didn't align with his preferred narrative. This isn't productive. We're both upset and saying things we might regret. The deflection was so characteristic it almost made me smile. James had always been skilled at redirecting difficult conversations when they weren't proceeding to his advantage. Actually, I said, I think this might be the most honest conversation we've had in years, and I don't regret anything I've said. I moved to the window, watching raindrops trace patterns down the glass. The street below was quiet, our neighbors' windows glowing with the ordinary rhythms of Tuesday evening life, dinner preparations, children's homework, the steady heartbeat of routines that continued regardless of personal upheaval. Where do we go from here? James finally asked, his tone suggesting he expected me to provide the roadmap for our dissolution, just as I'd managed so many other aspects of our shared life. That depends, I replied, turning back to face him. Are you still seeing Elise? The question clearly caught him off guard. He hesitated, seemingly weighing possible responses before settling on a reluctant truth. Yes. Is she why you came directly here from Silver Bay instead of staying at the Harbor Inn as I'd arranged? His expression confirmed my suspicion before he answered. She needed to get back to Boston for work. I drove her car while she took the train. I see, I said, though what I really saw went beyond his simple explanation. I saw the comfortable presumption that I would accommodate his choices, however uncomfortable they made me. I saw the continued prioritization of Elise's needs alongside his own, with mine as an afterthought. I know you're angry, he continued when I didn't immediately respond further. You have every right to be, but I think we should approach this rationally. We have history, shared assets, intertwined lives. We don't need to destroy everything because of one mistake. One mistake, I repeated slowly. 7 months of systematic deception isn't one mistake, James. It's thousands of individual choices to betray my trust day after day. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. What do you want from me? An apology? Fine. I'm sorry. I handled everything badly. But people recover from affairs all the time. Marriages survive this kind of crisis. Some do, I acknowledged, but those usually involve genuine remorse, not strategic damage control. James set his glass down with more force than necessary. You've already decided then. You've already written us off. No, I said quietly. You did that when you started building a life with someone else while pretending to share one with me. We stared at each other across the study, the physical space between us a fraction of the emotional distance that had opened. In his eyes, I could see calculations happening, assessments of financial implications, professional repercussions, social consequences. Always the strategist, even in crisis. I'm going to stay at the guest room at David's for a few days, he finally said, referring to his business partner. Give us both some space to think. That's probably best, I agreed, surprising myself with how little I felt at the prospect of him leaving. Where was the desperate need to fix things that had defined so much of our marriage? The accommodating flexibility that had bent my needs around his preferences? They had been replaced by something steadier, more resolute. He moved toward the door, then paused. What will you tell people? About the beach house? About us? The question revealed so much about his priorities, image management still foremost among his concerns. The truth, I said simply. Not as punishment, but because I'm done contorting myself to maintain appearances. Something like resignation crossed his face. I'll get some things and go. I remained in the study while he moved through our bedroom, bathroom, and closet, gathering essentials for what we both understood would be more than just a few days away. The sound of drawers opening and closing, zippers being fastened, the ordinary soundtrack of packing now laden with the weight of unraveling. When he returned, overnight bag in hand, he looked smaller somehow. The confident executive momentarily replaced by a man facing the consequences of his choices. I do care. About you, Rebecca, he said, standing in the doorway. Whatever you might think right now, that hasn't changed. I believe you, I replied, surprising us both with my sincerity. But caring isn't the same as respecting, And it certainly isn't the same as loving, honestly. After he left, the house settled into a different kind of silence. Not the hollow echo of an empty space, but the peaceful quiet of a place no longer filled with unspoken tensions. I moved through each room slowly, reacquainting myself with my home as though seeing it through new eyes. In the kitchen, I noticed how James's preferences had dominated. The expensive coffee machine he'd insisted on, the professional grade, knives he rarely used but proudly displayed, the sleek minimalist aesthetic that had always felt slightly cold to me. In the living room, evidence of compromises, art I'd selected but framed to his specifications, furniture arranged to his preference, rather than for conversation or comfort. Our bedroom told the starkest story. My belongings had gradually migrated to smaller spaces over the years, my books confined to a single shelf, my clothes occupying barely a third of the closet, my reading chair relegated to a corner with insufficient light. I hadn't noticed the slow encroachment, the gradual diminishment of my physical presence in our shared space. It was nearly midnight when I finally settled at the small desk in what we called my hobby room, an extra bedroom ostensibly designated for my art supplies, but which had gradually accumulated James's overflow. Fitness equipment he rarely used, financial documents he didn't want in his pristine home office, sports memorabilia too juvenile for public rooms, but too sentimental to discard. I opened my laptop and began a list titled Reclamation, cataloging changes I wanted to make to spaces, schedules, and habits. Simple adjustments at first, rearranging the living room furniture, replacing the austere bedding with something softer, creating a proper studio space for my artwork. Then larger considerations, financial disentanglement, legal consultation, career possibilities I'd set aside to accommodate our joint life. Each item added to the list felt like drawing a full breath after years of shallow breathing. Not vindictive. Changes designed to erase James, but affirmative choices that honored my own preferences and priorities. At 1 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Charlotte. Checking in. How did it go? I considered how to distill the day's events into a message. Finally, I simply wrote, "The beach house is sold. James is staying with a friend. I'm okay, actually more than okay." Her response came immediately. "Proud of you. Call tomorrow?" "Yes," I replied. Lunch break, 12:30. As I prepared for bed, choosing the center of the mattress rather than my habitual side, setting the thermostat to my preferred temperature, rather than the cooler setting James insisted upon, I realized that the most significant change couldn't be listed in a document or achieved through rearranging furniture. It was internal, a fundamental shift in how I perceived myself and my right to prioritize my own well-being. For so long, I had defined love as accommodation, compromise as self-erasure, partnership as subordinating my preferences. The subtle martyrdom had seemed virtuous, evidence of my commitment and capacity for selflessness. Now I recognized it for what it truly was, a slow surrender of self that served neither of us well. True partnership required two whole people bringing their authentic selves to the relationship, not one person contorting to fill the spaces another left vacant. James and I had fallen into a dynamic where his expansiveness required my contraction, where his certainties were built upon my doubts, where his freedom necessitated my constraints. Sleep came easier than I expected, deep and dreamless. I woke to sunlight streaming through curtains I'd forgotten to close, illuminating dust motes that danced in golden beams across the bedroom. For a moment, disorientation. Why was I in the center of the bed? Where was James? Then remembrance, not as a crushing weight, but as simple clarity. This was the first day of a different life, one I was authoring myself. My phone screen showed 3 missed calls from James and a text message time-stamped 3:17 a.m. We should talk. Properly. Dinner tomorrow? The presumption was so characteristic it almost made me smile. The assumption that I would accommodate his schedule, meet on his terms, participate in the conversation he wanted to have rather than the one I needed. I set the phone aside without responding and moved through my morning routine with a new awareness. The subtle ways I had always rushed through self-care to ensure breakfast was ready when James came downstairs. The habitual checking of his calendar to anticipate his needs before he expressed them. The constant low-grade vigilance about potential sources of friction I might smooth away before they materialized. Today, I moved at my own pace. I made coffee exactly as I preferred it. Lighter, roast, touch of cinnamon, actual sugar instead of the artificial sweetener James insisted was healthier. I ate breakfast on the back porch, watching birds flit among the small garden I'd planted last spring, and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd simply sat still without simultaneously planning, anticipating, or managing something for our shared life. At 10 a.m., I called Diana, the attorney who had advised me about the beach house sale. "I'm ready to move forward," I told her when she answered. "Can we meet to discuss divorce proceedings?" "Of course," she replied, her tone professional but warm. "Are you free this afternoon? I have an opening at 3. As I confirmed the appointment, I felt none of the shame or failure I had expected might accompany those words. Divorce proceedings. Instead, there was a sense of appropriate action, of alignment between my external choices and internal truth. Before leaving for the meeting, I finally responded to James's text. "I agree we need to talk, but not dinner, not yet. I'll be speaking with Diana Gardner this afternoon about legal next steps. I suggest you do the same with representation of your choice. We can schedule a conversation once that's in place." His response came immediately. "Don't you think legal involvement is premature? We haven't even tried to work through this." The message so perfectly encapsulated our fundamental disconnect that it strengthened my resolve rather than weakening it. In James's world, working through this meant proceeding according to his timeline, his comfort level, his terms. My independent action represented not self-protection, but defiance of an established order, where my role was to wait, accommodate, and eventually acquiesce. "Legal involvement isn't about hostility," I wrote back. "It's about clarity. I'll be at Diana's office at 3 if you'd like your attorney to contact her after that." Diana's office occupied the second floor of a beautifully restored Victorian in Cambridge, its interior balancing professional efficiency with unexpected warmth. Much like Diana herself. At 56, she projected the calm confidence of someone who had navigated countless complex situations, without losing sight of the humans involved in legal processes. "Tell me where you are right now," she said once we were settled in her office, sunlight streaming through leaded glass windows onto a conference table made from reclaimed wood. Not legally, but personally. The question caught me off guard. I had prepared to discuss assets, timelines, and strategies, the practical architecture of dismantling a marriage. Instead, Diana was inviting me to articulate my emotional landscape, to name what I wanted beyond the technical dissolution of legal bonds. I began, then paused, searching for the right words. "I'm surprisingly clear, sad about what's been lost, certainly, angry at the deception. But mostly I feel ready to reclaim my life, not as a reaction to James's betrayal, but as an affirmation of my own worth." Diana nodded, making a note on her yellow legal pad. That clarity will serve you well. Many clients come to me swinging between vindictiveness and desperate reconciliation attempts. Both make the process more painful than necessary. She asked thoughtful questions about our financial situation, professional trajectories, property holdings, and the timeline of James's affair. I answered as precisely as possible, referring occasionally to notes I'd prepared. Based on what you've shared, Diana said after we'd covered the essentials, I'd categorize this as a relatively straightforward dissolution in legal terms. Massachusetts is an equitable distribution state, not a community property state, which gives judges significant discretion in dividing marital assets fairly, not necessarily equally. What does that mean in practical terms? I asked. It means that factors like the length of your marriage, your respective incomes and earning potential, contribution to marital assets, and yes, the impact of infidelity can all affect distribution. In a case like yours, long-term marriage, professional, equality, documented infidelity, you're in a strong position to receive at least 50% of marital assets, potentially more. She leaned forward slightly, her expression compassionate but direct. But the question you need to consider is what constitutes winning for you. Is it extracting maximum financial benefit? Achieving the swiftest resolution? Establishing the most sustainable future foundation? These aren't mutually exclusive, but priorities matter when difficult choices arise. The question resonated deeply. What did constitute winning in a situation where the original prize, a faithful, loving partnership, was no longer available? What outcome would allow me to move forward with integrity rather than lingering in the shadow of betrayal? I want fairness, not punishment, I said slowly, the words clarifying my thoughts as I spoke them. I want acknowledgement of what happened without a protracted battle that keeps me tethered to anger. Mostly, I want the freedom to rebuild without unnecessary complications. Diana's smile conveyed approval without condescension. That's a foundation we can work with. Now let's talk strategy. Autumn arrived with startling swiftness that year, as though the natural world had synchronized with my internal timeline for transformation. Leaves turned crimson and gold practically overnight, the morning air developed a crisp edge, and I found myself reaching for sweaters that still smelled faintly of cedar from the previous winter's storage. 3 months had passed since that rainy night when James had packed a bag and stepped out of our shared home. 3 months of legal discussions, financial assessments, and the careful dismantling of a life built over 17 years. Some days felt impossibly hard, stumbling across an old anniversary card while sorting paperwork, or receiving a message from mutual friends who didn't yet know about our separation. Other days brought unexpected moments of liberation, rearranging furniture without consultation, planning trips I'd always wanted to take, rediscovering passions I'd set aside to accommodate our joint priorities. Today marked a significant milestone. Our mediation session with Diana Gardner representing me and Martin Calloway representing James. We had agreed to attempt mediation before proceeding to more adversarial divorce proceedings, a decision that seemed to surprise both attorneys given the circumstances of our separation. Most couples with infidelity issues struggle to stay civil enough for productive mediation, Diana had remarked when I suggested it. Are you certain this is the direction you want to take? I was certain, though my reasons weren't entirely altruistic. Drawn-out legal battles would keep me emotionally tethered to James and the betrayal. Mediation offered the possibility of a cleaner break and a swifter transition to whatever came next. As I dressed for the session, selecting a forest green wrap dress that Charlotte had insisted I buy during her recent visit, "It's the perfect color for transition," she'd declared with typical certainty, I caught my reflection in the bedroom mirror. The woman looking back at me appeared more centered, more present than the person who had discovered her husband's betrayal 4 months earlier. There was a steadiness in my gaze that hadn't been there before. Not hardness, but clarity. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. "Conference room reserved from 10-2. Take your time reviewing documents this morning. Remember, we're seeking resolution, not victory." Her reminder aligned perfectly with the mantra I'd adopted during this process. Progress, not perfection. Resolution, not retribution. I hadn't always managed to embody those principles. There had been moments of rage when I discovered additional financial deceptions, days of grief when the full scope of lost time and misplaced trust hit me anew. But I returned to that centering intention repeatedly, refusing to let bitterness become my primary fuel. The mediation office occupied a converted brownstone in Cambridge, its interior designed to feel more residential than institutional. Overstuffed. Chairs rather than conference seating, warm lighting instead of fluorescent overheads, artwork on walls that might otherwise feel oppressively formal. I arrived 15 minutes early to ground myself in the space, taking deep breaths as I reviewed the prioritized list Diana and I had created. Non-negotiables, preferred outcomes, and acceptable compromises. James arrived precisely at 10, his punctuality as reliable as ever. He wore his standard business attire, charcoal suit, blue shirt, subtly patterned tie. But something about him appeared different, less certain, perhaps. The easy confidence that had once seemed so fundamental to his character had been replaced by something more guarded. "Rebecca," he nodded as he entered, maintaining a professional distance. "You look well." "Thank you," I replied, the simple acknowledgement requiring no reciprocal compliment or extended conversation. Diana and Martin joined us a moment later, exchanging the cordial greetings of professionals who recognized they would likely encounter each other repeatedly in their line of work. A third person followed, Grace Chen, the mediator we had selected from a short list of candidates, a former judge with a reputation for fairness and efficiency. "Before we begin," Grace said once we were all seated around the circular table, "I want to establish some ground rules. This process works best when we focus on future arrangements rather than past grievances. While acknowledging hurt is important, productive mediation requires looking forward toward solutions both parties can live with. Can we agree to that approach?" We all nodded, though I noticed James's jaw tighten slightly. In our marriage, he had always been the one to determine when difficult conversations were productive or when they should be set aside for more rational discussion. Having an external arbiter establish those parameters shifted the dynamic, in subtle but significant ways. "Excellent," Grace continued. "I've reviewed the financial disclosures and preliminary position statements from both sides. Today, we'll address 3 main categories: property division, financial assets, and spousal support. Based on your materials, it appears there are no child custody issues, correct?" "Correct," Diana confirmed. "Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan have no children." The simple statement carried a complex emotional history. Our decision to stop fertility treatments after my second miscarriage had been mutual at the time, though James had occasionally revisited the subject in ways that felt like subtle blame. Now I wondered if Elise represented not just a new romantic partner, but a potential second chance at the family he'd eventually decided he wanted after all. "Let's begin with property," Grace suggested, consulting her notes. "The primary residence in Boston is jointly owned, while the beach property was recently sold." "Is that accurate?" "The beach property was solely in my client's name," Diana clarified. "Its sale occurred before formal separation, and the proceeds remain in an account under Mrs. Sullivan's name." Martin leaned forward slightly. "Well, technically, correct. The timing and circumstances of that sale, conducted without my client's knowledge while he was present at the property, suggest an intent to unilaterally control what had been treated as a shared marital asset throughout the marriage." I felt a flush of anger at the characterization, but remained silent, following Diana's guidance to let her handle these initial exchanges. "The circumstances surrounding that sale are directly related to Mr. Sullivan's documented infidelity, which occurred in the property in question," Diana countered smoothly. "Massachusetts law specifically allows judges to consider marital misconduct when it's directly related to dissipation or misuse of marital assets, which we believe is relevant here." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "I understand both positions. For the purpose of today's mediation, let's acknowledge that the beach property proceeds represent a significant asset whose distribution needs resolution, without debating the propriety of the sale itself. What proposals do each of you have regarding these funds?" And so it began, the careful navigation of competing interests, legitimate needs, and the accumulated financial entanglements of nearly 2 decades together. We discussed investment accounts, retirement funds, art and furniture, even the vintage wine collection James had meticulously curated over the years. Each item required consideration not just of monetary value, but of emotional significance and future practicality. Throughout the morning session, I noticed something shifting in James's demeanor. The defensive posture he'd initially adopted gradually gave way to something more reflective. When we broke for lunch, he asked if we might speak privately. "Is that advisable?" I asked Diana quietly. "As long as you're comfortable," she replied. "Sometimes direct communication can move things forward in ways formal negotiations can't. But you're under no obligation." 15 minutes, I told James. "There's a small courtyard behind the building." Outside, autumn sunshine filtered through nearly bare maple branches, creating a dappled pattern across the brick patio. We sat on a bench, maintaining careful distance between us. "This is more civilized than I expected," James said after a moment of silence. "Did you think I would be vengeful?" I asked, genuinely curious about how he'd anticipated this process unfolding. He considered the question before answering. "Not vengeful, exactly. But after the beach house, I thought you might be harder, more punitive." "The beach house wasn't about punishment," I said, repeating what I'd told him months earlier. "It was about consequences and self-protection." "I understand that better now," he admitted, surprising me with his candor. "That day, seeing you stand your ground so clearly, it forced me to recognize how much I'd taken for granted, how I'd assumed your accommodation was something I was entitled to rather than a choice you were making." The acknowledgement, so long in coming, landed differently than I might have expected months ago. It validated my experience without fundamentally changing the reality of our situation. "Why did you want to speak privately?" I asked, steering us back to the present moment. James looked down at his hands, the gesture uncharacteristically uncertain. I wanted to tell you I'm not going to contest the division Diana proposed for the beach house proceeds. You're right that it was your property legally, and while I contributed to its maintenance, the sale proceeds should remain primarily yours. The concession was unexpected enough that I studied his face carefully, looking for the strategic angle. What prompted this change? Several things, he said slowly. Conversations with my therapist about entitlement and consequences. Realizing how my actions must have appeared from your perspective. And honestly, watching how you've handled this entire process with such dignity, it's made me reconsider what kind of person I want to be moving forward. You're seeing a therapist? I asked, focusing on the detail that most surprised me. James had always dismissed therapy as navel-gazing when I'd suggested it during rough patches in our marriage. He nodded, almost embarrassed. Martin insisted, actually, said I needed to address my pattern of avoiding responsibility if I wanted. Realistic expectations for the divorce settlement. A small laugh escaped me before I could suppress it. Your divorce attorney sent you to therapy? He said judges have very little patience for affluent men with selective accountability issues, James admitted, a rueful smile briefly crossing his face. Apparently, I fit a profile he's seen lose badly in court. The moment of shared humor felt strange. A flash of the connection we'd once had appearing in the most unexpected context. It didn't change the fundamental reality of our situation, but it softened something between us, allowing space for a different kind of conversation. How is Elise? I asked, the question emerging without bitterness, simple curiosity about the woman who had played such a significant role in our story. James looked startled by the inquiry. We're not together anymore. It ended about a month ago. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. Whatever pain their relationship had caused me, I took no pleasure in additional broken connections. Don't be, he replied. It was necessary. Good, even. Something my therapist said about breaking patterns rather than just transferring them to new relationships. He paused, then added, Some lessons come at a very high price. The simple acknowledgement contained more genuine accountability than any of the calculated apologies he'd offered immediately after being caught. It suggested growth rather than merely strategic repositioning. Thank you for telling me about the beach house proceeds, I said, standing as our 15 minutes drew to a close. I appreciate the gesture. As we returned to the mediation room, I felt a subtle but significant shift in the energy. Not reconciliation, that bridge had been thoroughly burned, but perhaps something equally valuable, the possibility of completion without lasting animosity. The afternoon session proceeded more smoothly than the morning. With the beach house issue resolved, we worked through remaining financial matters with surprising efficiency. By 4 o'clock, we had outlined a comprehensive settlement agreement that Diana described as eminently fair to both parties. We'll draw up the formal documents based on today's decisions, Grace said as we prepared to leave. Once they're ready, review them with your respective attorneys, then we'll reconvene for final signatures. Unless either of you has questions, I believe we've accomplished what we needed to today. Outside, autumn twilight was settling over. Cambridge, street lamps flickering to life as students hurried across Harvard Yard bundled against the evening chill. James and I stood awkwardly on the sidewalk, the formality of the mediation room evaporating in the ordinary setting of early evening. Can I give you a ride home? He offered, gesturing toward his car parked nearby. Thank you, but I drove myself, I replied, then added impulsively, Would you like to get coffee? There's something I've been wanting to discuss outside the legal context. His surprise was evident, but he nodded. There's a decent place around the corner. The cafe was busy with students hunched over laptops, the air fragrant with espresso and cinnamon. We found a small table near the window, ordered, and sat in surprisingly comfortable silence until our drinks arrived. "What did you want to discuss?" James finally asked, wrapping his hands around his mug. I took a deep breath, organizing thoughts I'd been considering for weeks. "I'm planning to sell the Boston house once the divorce is finalized." "Oh," he said, clearly caught off guard. "I assumed you'd want to keep it." "I did too, initially," I acknowledged. "But the more I've thought about it, the more I realize I need a fresh start in a space that doesn't carry so many memories. Good and bad." He nodded slowly. "That makes sense. Have you thought about where you'll go?" "I've been looking at the South End," I said. "Something smaller, but with enough room for a proper art studio. I'm going to focus more seriously on painting again." "You should," he said with surprising warmth. "You've always been talented. I regret that I didn't encourage that aspect of your life more actively." The simple acknowledgement touched me, unexpectedly. "Thank you for saying that." We sipped our coffee, the conversation turning to practical matters, when he would collect remaining belongings from the house, which mutual friends had been told about our separation, professional connections that needed clarification about our changed status. As we prepared to leave, James hesitated, his expression uncertain. "I know it doesn't change anything that happened, but I am truly sorry, Rebecca. Not just for the affair, but for the 1,000 small ways I diminished you over the years. You deserved better." The apology, offered without expectation of forgiveness or reconciliation, felt like the closing of a circle, not erasing what had occurred, but acknowledging it fully, creating space for both of us to move forward without the burden of unspoken truths. "Thank you," I said simply. "I hope you find what you're looking for, James. I really do." Walking. To my car afterward, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. Not the absence of pain. There was still grief for what had been lost, anger at the deception, moments of fear about an unfamiliar future. But beneath those expected emotions ran a current of certainty. I was exactly where I needed to be, traveling a path that was fully mine to choose. 6 months later, I stood in the empty Boston townhouse, afternoon sunlight streaming through windows stripped of curtains, hardwood floors gleaming after their final cleaning. The closing had gone smoothly that morning, the young couple who purchased the property already excitedly discussing renovation plans as we signed the papers. "Any last-minute regrets?" Charlotte asked, leaning against the doorframe of what had once been my living room. She had flown in to help with the final move, her practical efficiency and unflagging support a constant throughout these months of transition. "Not about selling," I replied honestly. "Though it's strange to think we won't have Christmas dinner in that bay window anymore, or summer gatherings on the back patio." "You'll create new traditions," she said confidently, crossing the room to stand beside me. "In spaces that are entirely yours from the beginning." She was right, of course. My new apartment in the South End already felt more authentically mine than this house ever had, even after just 2 weeks. The wall of windows in the converted factory building provided perfect northern light for the studio I'd established. The open floor plan allowed for the comfortable, slightly bohemian aesthetic I'd always been drawn to, but had compromised on in deference to James's more minimal preferences. "Ready for the final walkthrough?" Charlotte asked, checking her watch. The new owners are meeting the inspector here at 4. I nodded, taking a last slow circuit through the empty rooms, not seeking closure. I'd already found that through the deliberate choices of recent months, but honoring the significance of this transition. In the master bedroom, I paused at the window overlooking the small garden I'd tended for years, mentally wishing well for the saplings I'd planted last spring that someone else would see mature. You know what feels strange? I said as we descended the stairs for the final time. I expected to feel more traumatized by all of this. The dissolution of a 17-year marriage should be more devastating than it has been. Charlotte considered this as we reached the entryway. Maybe because you've been treating it as a transformation rather than just a loss. You've been building something new instead of just mourning what ended. Her observation crystallized something I'd been feeling, but hadn't fully articulated. Each decision over these months, from the beach house sale to the mediation approach to this final property transition, had been about forward movement rather than reaction. Not denying the pain, but refusing to center it as the primary narrative of this chapter. Outside, spring had arrived in earnest. Cherry blossoms dusting the sidewalk with pale pink petals, early tulips standing at attention in neighborhood garden beds. We walked to my car, now packed with the last few personal items that hadn't gone to storage or my new apartment. Dinner at that new Thai place near your building? Charlotte suggested as we buckled our seatbelts. I think celebration is in order. Celebration? I echoed, surprised by her framing. Absolutely, she insisted. Today marks the completion of one of the hardest transitions a person can navigate, and you've done it with remarkable grace. If that's not worth celebrating, I don't know what is. As we drove away from the house that had been the center of my life for so long, I realized she was right. This journey, painful as it had been, represented something profound. The reclamation of my own agency, the courage to face difficult truths, and the resilience to build something new from the fragments of broken expectations. The settlement with James had been finalized 2 months earlier, our last meeting marked by a surprising lack of acrimony. We'd wished each other well with what felt like genuine goodwill, the raw edges of betrayal softened by time and perspective. He had accepted a position with a firm in Chicago, making a clean geographical break that seemed healthy for both of us. Elise had sent me an unexpected letter shortly after the divorce was finalized, not seeking forgiveness exactly, but acknowledging her role in the pain caused and expressing a genuine hope for my healing. I'd appreciated the gesture more than I would have predicted, recognizing it as an act of accountability that helped close that chapter more completely. You know what I realized recently? I said to Charlotte as we navigated familiar streets that would soon belong to someone else's daily patterns. If I could somehow go back and prevent James's affair from happening, I'm not sure I would. She shot me a skeptical look. Really? You'd choose to go through all this pain willingly? Not for the pain itself, I clarified, but for what it catalyzed. Without that disruption, I might have continued indefinitely in a marriage that wasn't allowing either of us to be our full selves. I might never have reclaimed my painting, or recognized how much I'd compromised my own authenticity in the name of keeping peace. Silver linings from storm clouds, Charlotte mused. Though I still think he deserved that beach house moment. That was your finest hour. I laughed, remembering the mix of shock and grudging respect on James's face that day in Silver Bay. It wasn't about revenge. I know, she said more seriously. It was about reclaiming your power. And look where that first step has led you. Where it had led was still unfolding, a life redesigned according to my own priorities rather than joint compromises. A career shift that incorporated more art and teaching. Friendships deepened through vulnerability, rather than maintained through careful presentation of an idealized life. A growing comfort with solitude that wasn't loneliness, but spaciousness, for possibility. The road ahead remained uncharted in many ways. There would be difficult days, moments of doubt, times when the weight of starting over might feel overwhelming. But as we turned onto the street leading to my new home, cherry blossoms swirling in our wake like confetti, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the painful awakening that had set this journey in motion. Some endings, even the most painful ones, are really beginnings in disguise. The vacation home I'd lost had given me something far more valuable, the courage to create a life that truly felt like home. The gallery lights cast a gentle glow over my paintings, transforming colors I'd labored over for months into something almost ethereal. Standing in the corner of the room, champagne flute in hand, I watched as strangers moved from canvas to canvas, some pausing briefly before continuing on, others lingering with heads tilted in contemplation. My first solo exhibition, a milestone. I hadn't dared imagine 2 years ago when my marriage imploded. "Which one is your favorite?" asked a voice beside me. I turned to find Meredith, the real estate agent who had helped me sell the beach house, now a friend whose straightforward practicality had become a welcome presence in my new life. "That's like asking a mother to choose between her children," I replied with a smile, though my eyes drifted instinctively toward the largest canvas in the collection. A seascape bathed in twilight colors, the transition between day and night, captured in layers of violet, indigo, and deepening orange. "Silver Bay at dusk," Meredith read from the small placard. "Is that?" "Yes," I nodded. "The view from the deck of the beach house. I painted it from memory." "It's stunning," she said, studying the brushwork more closely. "There's something so peaceful about it, but with this undercurrent of... I don't know how to describe it." "Transformation," I supplied. "It's about that moment when one state of being shifts into another. Not quite day anymore, not fully night yet. The in-between space where everything is possible." Meredith gave me a knowing look. "Rather autobiographical, wouldn't you say?" I laughed softly. "I suppose all art is, in some way. We can only create from what we've lived." The exhibition represented 2 years of intensive work. Weekends, evenings, early mornings spent in my South End studio with music playing and light streaming through the industrial windows. What had begun as therapeutic expression gradually evolved into a coherent artistic voice, one that gallery owner Elena Vasquez had recognized immediately when she visited on the recommendation of my art mentor. "Your work speaks to transition, with remarkable honesty," Elena had said, moving from canvas to canvas in my studio 6 months earlier. "There's pain here, yes, but it's neither sentimentalized nor sensationalized. It simply exists alongside hope, curiosity, even humor. That's rare." When she'd offered me a solo exhibition, I'd initially demurred, claiming I wasn't ready. The truth was more complicated. Stepping into an identity as a real artist, after decades of treating painting as merely a hobby, required a courage different from anything my divorce had demanded. It meant claiming space not just in a physical sense, but in the narrative of how I defined myself to the world. "Rebecca." Charlotte's voice pulled me from my reverie. She moved toward me through the crowd, resplendent in a crimson dress that complemented her now silver hair. 2 years cancer-free, my sister had embraced her post-chemo appearance with characteristic boldness, refusing wigs in favor of what she called her hard-earned wisdom crown. "What do you think?" I asked, gesturing to the gallery space where approximately 40 people mingled, studied paintings, and sipped wine. "I think you've arrived," she said simply, squeezing my arm. "And not just as an artist. Look at you, hosting your own exhibition, building a new career, thriving in ways neither of us could have predicted when all this started." Her words, registered not as flattery, but as recognition of the distance traveled since that rainy night in Boston, when James had packed a bag and left our house. The journey hadn't been linear. There had been setbacks, moments of doubt, days when grief ambushed me unexpectedly, but the overall trajectory had been toward growth rather than mere survival. "Have you seen the sales tags?" Charlotte asked with barely contained excitement. "Elena's already put red dots on 7 paintings." I blinked in surprise. 7? Already? 8, actually, came Elena's voice as she joined our small circle. The gallery owner, elegant in her 60s with a Swiss accent and impeccable taste, smiled warmly. "Including Silver Bay at dusk." A tech executive from New York fell in love with it immediately, said it reminded him of childhood summers on Cape Cod. A curious pang moved through me, not regret exactly, but acknowledgement of how objects and places transfer between lives, carrying different meanings for each caretaker. The beach house itself now belonged to the Branning family, who had sent holiday cards showing their twin daughters building sandcastles on what had once been my stretch of shore. Now this painted memory would hang in a stranger's home, evoking someone else's nostalgia. "That's wonderful," I said, genuinely pleased despite the bittersweet undertone. "I hope it brings him joy." He also inquired about commissioning a companion piece, Elena continued. "Same location but at dawn instead of dusk. Are you interested in commission work?" Before I could answer, my attention was caught by a familiar figure entering the gallery. Thomas Hargrove, my former department chair from the university where I now taught art part-time, scanned the room before spotting me. He raised a hand in greeting, then pointed to his wristwatch with a questioning expression. "Excuse me," I said to Charlotte and Elena. "I need to speak with Thomas briefly. Apparently I'm running late for something I didn't know I was scheduled for." I navigated through the crowd, accepting congratulations and fielding questions with brief responses, aware of time ticking toward whatever Thomas was reminding me about. When I reached him, his characteristic mixture of enthusiasm and mild exasperation was evident. "Please tell me you didn't forget your own interview," he said, by way of greeting. Though his smile took any sting from the words, I stared at him blankly. "Interview?" "With Boston Arts Review," he clarified. "Maya Chen is waiting in the coffee shop across the street. I told her you were probably caught up with collectors and would be there by 7:30. "Thomas?" I groaned, checking my watch. "It's 7:25 and this is the first I'm hearing about any interview." "I sent you an email last week," he insisted, "and a text yesterday. Maya's doing a feature on mid-career artists transitioning from other professions. Your story is perfect. Former academic administrator discovers her artistic voice after personal upheaval." He gestured toward the gallery. "And now this successful debut exhibition." The description made me laugh despite my annoyance at the miscommunication. Mid-career artist? I'm 45 and only started taking my work seriously 2 years ago. Which makes you infinitely more interesting than some 20-something fresh out of art school, Thomas countered. Maya specifically requested you after seeing the exhibition preview. This is good publicity, Rebecca. I sighed, recognizing he was right. Give me 5 minutes to tell Elena I'm stepping out and I'll be there. As Thomas waited by the door, I quickly explained the situation to Elena, who waved me off with encouraging words about press coverage being essential for emerging artists. Charlotte promised to keep an eye on things and text me if any serious collectors had questions only I could answer. Outside, the September evening was pleasantly cool, the transitional weather between summer's heat and autumn's chill mirroring the liminality I so often explored in my work. The coffee shop across from the gallery was busy but not crowded, with enough ambient noise for privacy without shouting. Maya Chen proved to be younger than I'd expected, early 30s perhaps, with short-cropped hair, intelligent eyes behind tortoise-shell glasses, and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. Professor Hargrove explained the mix-up, she said, gesturing for me to sit. I appreciate you making time during your opening. Please, call me Rebecca, I insisted, and I should be thanking you for your interest in my work. Maya smiled, setting a small recorder on the table between us. Mind if I record our conversation? It helps me ensure I'm quoting you accurately. When I nodded agreement, she pressed a button and jumped straight in. Your exhibition title, Thresholds, suggests transitions, boundaries being crossed. Was that theme intentional from the beginning, or did it emerge as you created the collection? The directness of her question bypassed standard pleasantries, but I appreciated the immediate engagement with substance. It emerged gradually, I explained. I didn't set out with a thematic framework. I was simply painting what preoccupied me, those moments of crossing from one state of being into another. And that preoccupation grew from your personal experience with divorce, correct? Her gaze was direct, but not invasive. I'd known my personal history would be relevant to any coverage of my work, had prepared myself for questions that probed the connection between life and art. Still, the bluntness caught me slightly off guard. Yes, though not exclusively, I replied carefully. There were several significant transitions happening simultaneously. My marriage ending, my sister's cancer diagnosis and recovery, my professional pivot from administration to teaching, and art. The paintings explore that larger experience of standing at the threshold between what was and what might be. Maya nodded, making a quick note. Your technical approach is interesting. These layers of translucent color that seem to shift depending on viewing angle. Did you develop that technique specifically for this body of work? The conversation flowed more easily as we moved into discussion of artistic process, influences, and the practical challenges of establishing a studio practice in midlife. Maya asked thoughtful questions that revealed she'd done her research, not only about my exhibition, but about the trajectory that had brought me to this point. You mentioned teaching, she said as our interview approached the 30-minute mark. She'd requested. How does your experience as an educator inform your artistic practice? It creates a wonderful reciprocity, I explained. Teaching forces me to articulate what often happens intuitively in my own studio. And my students, many of whom are returning to art after pursuing other careers or raising families, constantly remind me that creative development isn't linear. There's no expiration date on discovering or rediscovering your voice. Maya smiled, jotting something in her notebook. That's a powerful message in a culture obsessed with youthful success stories. Speaking of voices, I understand your ex-husband has relocated to Chicago. The abrupt pivot back to my personal life was jarring, but I maintained my composure. Yes, though I'm not sure how that's relevant to a discussion of my artwork. Forgive me, she said, though her expression suggested the question had been deliberate. I'm interested in how geographical distance affects the processing of significant transitions. Does physical separation create emotional clarity? Many of your paintings suggest observation from a remove, the viewer positioned at a distance from landscapes in flux. The insight was perceptive enough that my initial defensive reaction softened. That's an interesting connection I hadn't consciously made, I admitted. But yes, there's something to the idea that distance, both temporal and geographical, allows for a different kind of seeing. Not detachment exactly, but perspective. Our conversation concluded shortly after, with Maya promising to send quotes for approval before publication. As we gathered our things, she hesitated, then asked a final question off the record. The beach house in Silver Bay at dusk. Do you regret selling it? I considered the question with genuine reflection rather than providing a rehearsed response. No, I finally said. That decision was a catalyst for everything that followed. Sometimes releasing what you're clutching most tightly is the only way to open your hands for what's waiting to be received. Walking back to the gallery, I found myself thinking about the many forms of release these 2 years had required. Not just the beach house or the marriage, but countless smaller surrenders. Releasing expectations about how healing should progress. Surrendering the comfortable identities I'd constructed. Letting go of timelines for when I should feel over it or moved on. Inside, the exhibition was still lively, though the crowd had thinned somewhat. Charlotte beckoned me toward a small group gathered near a triptych of abstract landscapes, my most experimental pieces in the collection. Rebecca, she called, come meet Professor Abernathy. She's the curator I told you about from the museum. In Providence. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions, conversations about artistic influences, and fielding inquiries about potential commissions. By the time the last guests departed and Elena locked the gallery doors behind them, exhaustion and exhilaration competed for dominance in my body. 11 paintings sold, Elena announced triumphantly, consulting her tablet. Plus 3 commission requests and serious interest from Abernathy about including your work in the regional contemporary exhibition next spring. Not bad for an opening night, my dear. Charlotte handed me a glass of the champagne we'd been saving for this private moment of celebration. To new beginnings, she toasted, clinking her glass against mine. And to the woman who was brave enough to pursue them. Later that night, after Charlotte had returned to her hotel and the adrenaline of the event had finally ebbed, I sat alone on the terrace of my apartment, wrapped in a soft throw against the evening chill. The city lights created a glowing backdrop, so different from the natural rhythms of tides and stars that had marked evenings at Silver Bay. My phone buzzed with a text message. Expecting Charlotte with a forgotten detail about our breakfast plans, I was surprised to see James's name on the screen. Our communication had been minimal since the divorce was finalized, limited to occasional practical matters about finances or mutual acquaintances. Congratulations on your exhibition, the message read. Elena sent me the digital catalog. Your work is extraordinary. I stared at the screen, surprised not just by the contact but by my own lack of emotional turbulence. In response, there was no surge of anger or painful nostalgia, just a quiet acknowledgement of a connection that had once been central to my life and was now an occasional footnote. Thank you, I typed simply. How's Chicago treating you? His response came quickly. Well, started my own consulting firm last year. Smaller scale, but more aligned with what I actually value. Turns out therapy was useful for more than just divorce proceedings. The hint of self-deprecating humor was reminiscent of the James I'd first fallen in love with, before ambition and image management had calcified into the man who found it. Easier to lead a double life than have difficult conversations. I'm glad, I wrote, and meant it. Personal and professional alignment is worth pursuing. We exchanged a few more messages, brief updates about mutual friends, his mother's health, challenges, my new teaching position. The conversation was cordial, superficially warm without delving into territories that might reopen old wounds. When it concluded naturally after about 10 minutes, I felt a sense of completion rather than disruption. 2 years ago, I might have overanalyzed the exchange, searching for hidden meanings or allowing it to destabilize the new life I was building. Now it simply existed as a brief connection with someone who had once known me intimately, but whose opinion no longer defined my sense of self-worth. The realization wasn't dramatic. No thunderbolt of insight or triumphant declaration of complete healing. Just a quiet noticing of how far I'd traveled from the woman who had sat in a rental car outside the beach house, manila envelope in hand, gathering courage to confront betrayal. That journey had not been a straight line. There had been setbacks alongside breakthroughs, days when the pain felt as fresh as the moment of discovery. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the healing had outpaced the hurting until I found myself here, celebrating professional success, surrounded by supportive relationships, and genuinely curious about what might unfold next. As autumn leaves began their annual dance toward winter dormancy, I contemplated the seasonal wisdom inherent in nature's cycles. Every ending contained the seeds of beginning. Every release created space for new growth. Every threshold crossed led not to final destinations but to fresh pathways forward. Morning would bring practical matters, banking the exhibition proceeds, responding to commission inquiries, preparing for Monday's classes. Life would continue its ordinary rhythms alongside the extraordinary moments of achievement and recognition. Both aspects were equally valid, equally necessary for a well-lived existence. For now, though, I simply sat with the satisfaction of a milestone reached, not through dramatic gestures or vengeful triumphs, but through the quiet persistence of showing up day after day to the canvas of my own becoming. The work wasn't finished, would never be finished as long as breath remained. But tonight I could appreciate how far the journey had already come. The lights of Boston twinkled below, each one representing lives being lived in all their complex beauty and struggle. Somewhere across the city, a young couple might be settling into what had once been my carefully curated townhouse, making it their own. In Silver Bay, the Brannings had perhaps closed up the beach cottage for the season, preserving summer memories until next year's return. And here, on this terrace, wrapped in starlight and hard-earned wisdom, I lifted my glass in a final solitary toast, not to dramatic endings or triumphant new beginnings, but to the sacred space between them where real transformation happens. To thresholds crossed with courage, to the art of becoming. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.